Acts 17, verses 1 through 4. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. I'll preach on this text in the next service, but what we're going to do now is explore this series of intriguing words here about talking about Jesus. The end of verse 2, what's the first one of them? The end of verse 2, what did Paul do? Verse 3, what's the first one? Explaining and then proving. Okay, and then at the end of verse 3, we have the word saying. And then in verse 4, some of them were persuaded and joined. So we're going to talk about that series of words this morning, and basically we're just going to do some simple word study and cross-referencing. Your handout might not look simple to you, but it's just cross-references to other places where these words appear. That's all it is, which is a really great way to learn more about what the Bible's saying. So follow me as we work through this series of texts. And the point is, how do you talk about Jesus in wise ways? And I think the overall thing we want to see here is that all 5 of these things we're going to talk about really go together. It's not any one of them that ought to be our kind of passionate focus, but there is a breadth of wisdom in talking about Jesus. So let's just dive in. You'll see that as we go along. Number 1, he says that Paul was, on 3 Sabbath days, the end of verse 2, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. So our first word is reasoning, and if you look around in the rest of the New Testament for this word, what we find is that it's almost never used except from this point in Acts on, where it's used a whole bunch of times. So it's very much it's a word that's almost unique to Paul's ministry on the 2nd and 3rd missionary journeys and then in his trials. So I included some definition in your handout today. That's a little bit risky because I had to choose some parts. So I'm not saying that I put an entire and full-fledged definition there for you, but I chose some parts that were relevant for us. So this word reasoned, do you see there, if you just look at that Greek transliteration, what English word it sounds like? Dialogue, right. So we have this definition: to engage in speech interchange, converse, discuss, argue, or to instruct about something and inform. So you see from that definition there's some breadth of idea here, from reasoning to arguing to instructing. So it's going to depend on the context what it means, but there is a long history of this word in Greek philosophy, and basically what the Greek philosophers emphasized was that if we will learn to dialogue with each other, in other words, if we'll learn to have this open interchange of ideas, we will together move toward a fuller understanding of reality, or whatever you want to call it. Now, there's some truth to that idea, right? Like, there's a lot of value in listening and interacting and learning. The problem was they weren't talking about finding truth, like what's actually true. They were just talking about this kind of mutual pursuit of, it's kind of more along the lines of all religions are good and we can all learn from each other, and if we all learn from each other, we'll all kind of be better, you know? It was kind of that idea. So The New Testament use isn't necessarily along the lines of Greek philosophy, but let's just look at how it's used. So it's there in verse 2, Paul in Thessalonica reasoned in the synagogue from the Scriptures. And then look at verse 17. And we're going to be all over your Bibles this morning, so just be ready to turn with me to these passages quickly. Acts 17, verse 17, in Athens, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Chapter 18, verse 4, he reasoned. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. This is in Corinth. Chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. He entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly, reasoning. This is in Ephesus. So you see this word's getting used pretty much every time. Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus. Chapter 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when they were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. Where's our word there? How's it translated? It's just talked, right. So there it seems to be used more in its sense of just instructing. And same thing in verse 9. Eutychus sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer and fell down from the third story. Chapter 24, this is Paul's defense before Felix. Chapter 24, verse 12, they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Where's our word there? Disputing. So there it's used in the sense of arguing, right? And then verse 25, verse 24, after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control in the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away." So there you have Paul reasoning before Felix. Okay, so do you get a little bit of a feel for the breadth of the word? And one of the reasons why I'm doing this morning is just always trying to help us think about how to understand the Bible and Bible words. And one of the basic concepts when it comes to Bible words is, someone just said it this way, words don't have meanings, they have uses. Now that may be a little bit of an overstatement, but that is actually the point biblically. The question is, how did that author use that word in that place, right? And so you saw there that you've got, even in Acts 24, you got one place where that word is used in the sense of arguing, because Paul says they didn't find me arguing. It can't mean just giving instruction, because they found him doing that all over the place, right? But then in another place, it's reasoning, and he's instructing with the Ephesian elders. So what does it mean in Acts 17 then? What does it mean when it says, in the synagogue and in the marketplace in Athens, he reasoned with them? Which of those ideas would fit best? Should we go with kind of instruction, or should we go with arguing? I think there's a little clue in chapter 17. If you look at verse 18, look at chapter 17, verse 18. What's the clue there?
Also conversed.
Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers conversed with him, and that word definitely means to have a conversation, to go back and forth, like our modern word dialogue. So what was Paul doing in Acts 17? Probably, to go to the beginning of that definition, engaging in speech interchange. Probably instructing, but at the same time interacting and dialoguing. And so how's that a lesson that's helpful for us in terms of talking about Jesus? Well, right. Don't be argumentative, right? Be conversational. And so what does conversational mean in that sense? What do you mean by conversational? Give and take, right? Christians have a little bit of a reputation sometimes for wanting people to listen to us and not wanting to listen to anybody else. So, right, be conversational in that sense of willing to listen. And a basic question about that is, are you willing to let somebody else tell you what they believe? That's a pretty, I think, foundational thing Christians need to recognize and be willing to do. Scott?
You have a very good method of asking key questions.
Yeah, you can even draw out the conversation, right? Yeah, exactly right. Okay, so interchange is probably the idea there. Now, our English word reasoning brings to mind rationalizing, right? Isn't that kind of the connotation we have? And so I think it's important to look at some of the other passages and understand just a little bit about why the Bible makes it clear you can't rationalize someone into salvation. That's not what reasoning means in Acts 17. And the way we see this is by looking at the words that are related to dialegomai. So I put two more of them there in your handout. So you have, first of all, the noun, dialogismos, the process of reasoning, the content of reasoning or a conclusion reached through the use of reason, or the verbal exchange that takes place when conflicting ideas are expressed, in other words, an argument. And then there's this other verb that means to think or reason carefully, especially about the implications of something, to discuss a matter in some detail. So those are all from the same kind of word family. And let's just look at some of these passages because they are very, very instructive for us. So just follow me through the order there. Mark 7, first of all. Mark 7:21. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts. Okay, that's our word, reasonings. So what's in the heart of man? What kind of reasonings are native to man's heart? Evil ones. Mark 8, verse 17. Now we're talking about Jesus' disciples. Verse 14, they had forgotten to bring bread. Verse 15, he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? So did you see our word there? It's two times. What is it? Discussing. So they were reasoning together, trying to figure out, wait, what's this about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod and why we don't have any bread? And he says, you are not yet perceiving or understanding. Their reasoning was not headed in a good direction. They were not on track in their reasoning. Luke chapter 5. Will somebody read us Luke 5, 21 and 20? Well, start in verse 20. Verses 20 through 22.
And when he saw their faith, he said, man, your sins are forgiven you. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to question, saying, who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? When Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered them, why do you question in your hearts?
So our word is there two times. It's in verse 21. The scribes and Pharisees began to question. So here's how their reasoning went. Who is this who speaks blasphemies? And then verse 22, when Jesus perceived their thoughts, there's our noun, their reasonings. So how well were they doing with their reasoning? Their reasoning concluded that Jesus was a blasphemer. So they were off track. Luke 6.
But they were partly on track because at least they saw the implications that he was claiming something more than an average person.
Well, right. Surely. Forgiving sins.
Just they concluded the wrong direction.
Right. Luke 6, verses 7 and 8. Will somebody read those for us?
The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with
So you see the word there in, it's actually in verse 8. He knew their thoughts. He knew their reasonings. And their reasonings were to try to figure out how to trap Jesus. Luke chapter 9. Luke 9, 46 and 47. An argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side and said, whoever receives this child, etc., he who is least among you is the one who is great. So one of the things I want to point out to us here is that the Bible not only emphasizes that the reasonings of an unsaved person are evil and are not going to lead them to God in and of themselves, but the Bible also has some key passages, we're going to see two more of them here, that caution us about our own reasonings. And this one is especially poignant. You talk about something that hits home. Okay, so first of all, you and I reason all the time with ourselves. Our days are spent talking to ourselves, thinking through things, coming up with interpretations. And this kind of reasoning right here is so perniciously common in our hearts. The kind of reasoning that says, I'm actually better than that person, or I'm right and they're wrong, or how dare they question me, or whatever. That's the kind of reasoning our minds are very quick to process all the time. And so Jesus knew the reasoning of their hearts. See, he's connecting the reasoning of their hearts to their argument about which of them was the greatest. And I think the implication there is their argument about which one of them was the greatest made perfectly good sense to them. And that's where the caution is for us. Our reasonings with ourselves all day long make perfectly good sense to us. It all sounds right in our own heads. And we may be way off track in how we're thinking about ourselves. So it's not just the lost who we have to recognize their reasonings can't be trusted, but we have to be very careful with our own as well. Luke 20, verse 14. So this is a Jesus parable about the man who owns the vineyard sending his son finally to try to get the fruit he deserves. And verse 14, but when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, they reasoned with themselves, this is the heir, let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. Wow. This is how far man's rational thinking will take him, to the point of trying to figure out how to get rid of Jesus. That's where man's thoughts naturally go. How can I get Jesus out of my life? Luke 24, 38. Okay, here's a tricky one. Ready? Luke 24:38, Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection, and he said to them, why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Where's our word? It's the noun. It's doubts. Okay, why do reasonings arise in your hearts? But he's talking about a particular kind of reasoning that was off track. It was doubting. It was not believing. And so this reminds us that you and I can have a kind of mental reasoning going on in our heads that is faithless. It is not looking to God in faith. It is fearful, and it is doubting, and it is questioning, and it just spins and spins and spins in our own thinking. Why are you troubled, and why did doubts arise in your hearts? Okay, Romans 1. Let's quickly finish out this list. Romans 1, verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So there's our word, thinking. And then go over to 1 Corinthians 3. 1 Corinthians 3. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 20. So here it's stated as bluntly as you can state it. The Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. So even the wise, from the world standpoint, their best reasonings are vain. They're empty. They're not headed toward truth. And the Lord knows that. So in that regard, we should go back a page or two to 1 Corinthians 1. Now, this passage doesn't use our word or our word family, but it's still very relevant. 1 Corinthians 1:21. For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ crucified is Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, the weakness of God is stronger than men. So there you see that the world's wisdom is not going to find God because, first of all, they'll only find God through the gospel, and second of all, the gospel is the power of God to those who are called. And whatever theological arguments there may be about that, it is what it is. The gospel is the power of God to those who are called. And so that will help make sure we don't think that you can rationalize someone into salvation. That doesn't mean you don't listen. It doesn't mean you don't do the other things we're going to talk about here, which can be very important. But in the process of doing that, make sure you tell them the gospel. Make sure they get the basics of the crucified Jesus, because that's what God is going to use to bring salvation in that heart. Then finally, one last just passage about us as believers, James 2, verse 4. James 2, verse 1. My brothers, don't show any partiality. And if you do, verse 4, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Okay, so this just bookended. We started in Mark 7, out of the heart of man come evil reasonings. And we ended in James 2 with Christians, be careful. If you show partiality among one another, you have evil reasonings. But again, the point is, to those believers James was writing to, their reasonings made sense. It made sense to them why they should pay more attention to the one who had money than the one who didn't. They reasoned it through and it made sense, but it was evil. And so that just gives us a good reminder as believers that we need God constantly renewing us in our minds, in our reasoning. So, Chris.
I recall back before I was a Christian, in my late high school days, a fellow classmate giving me the gospel through track. It was gobbledygook to me back then. I remember it, but I remember it had at that time no impact. And I remember subsequently a couple other times gospel was presented. Again, it wasn't until I recognized there's a God, the Bible is His Word, Jesus is who He said He is. He's not a good man. He's a lot more. That now the gospel
Sure.
makes sense. So there was a point for reasoning and for working concepts out before the gospel is impacted.
Right. So look at our handout at the next two words, which both have to do with exactly that. So we're back in Acts 17, and the word in Acts 17:3 is that Paul was reasoning with them. And then in verse 3, the next word is explaining. This is a great word that literally means to open, and so it's used for opening things literally, like opening a womb, but then it's used figuratively for opening ears and opening eyes and opening hearts. And Luke 24 was Paul in Acts 17:3 opening eyes or opening hearts, or is that what it says he was doing? What was he opening? Well, God was doing that, but what was Paul opening? The scriptures, right? Luke 24, verse 32, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? And then verse 45, he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. So look at that combination of ideas. You have there someone opening the scriptures and someone opening their minds to understand the open scriptures. Now in Luke 24, it was the same someone, right? Jesus opened the scriptures and Jesus opened their minds. Go to Acts, and you have Jesus ascended and at the right hand of the throne of God, so he's not the one opening the scriptures anymore. It's Paul opening the scriptures, but go to Acts 16. Acts 16, remember this from Lydia? This is our word. The same word in Acts 17:3 is the word in Acts 16:14. The end of verse 14, the Lord opened Lydia's heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. So in Acts 16:14, Jesus opens Lydia's heart, and in Acts 17:3, Paul opened the scriptures. So what does that mean for us in terms of how we talk wisely about Jesus? Well, it connects very closely to what Chris was just saying. There is a very important role to be played in helping people understand. Isn't that what we mean by open the scriptures? We mean not just open them like use a verse. We mean explain. That's why the translators use that translation. Help them see why it means that, what it says. So it's I think it's a really helpful picture, the opening picture. Yolanda.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Luke 24, verse 16. Talking about the road to Emmaus, that their eyes were prevented from recognizing him, referring to Jesus. I love this whole portion of scripture. It's like, I'm like, Lord, why did you prevent them from knowing you at that moment? Could you?
I don't know what you expect me to say. I mean, because he's God. You know, it's Jesus said, Father, I thank you that you have hidden these things from the wise and revealed them to the babies, the infants. Why? Why did Jesus thank the Father? Because he's God. Because he does all things well and right. And I don't know what to say beyond that. He's God. And he never does anything that's not the right thing to do.
It just reminds me, like, it's really exciting in our home, Olivia being with child, but God is going to let that child be born in his time, and God is going to allow a person to be born again
Yeah.
in his time.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's where 1 Corinthians 1 is so sobering for us. The preaching of Christ crucified is going to be foolish, but for those who are called, it is going to be the power of God into salvation. And that's all in God's court. What's in our court is the sharing of the gospel with everybody. And all those things about opening eyes and calling and all that, that's all in God's court, not in our court, but it's real. It is a real factor. Daniel, then Chris.
Are these most of the references in the New Testament to these words?
Maybe all of them. Well, no. Yeah, which words? The whole handout, or?
Yeah, the handout.
They are just about all the relevant references.
So it's very interesting to me, and I'm thinking about almost every reasoning we see here is Jesus saying, hey, I understand his thoughts, and their thoughts are bad.
Yeah.
Futile thinking and doubts, and it's a little staggering to me, just to see how, I mean, I guess it shouldn't be, but it is just staggering to me how much their thinking was just wrong, and obviously how that connects to us and our thinking.
Yeah.
That is very humbling.
Yeah. Right. We're so quick to trust our own understanding, Proverbs 3, and that's just, it warns us against that very much. Chris?
What you just said, Daniel, reminds me and ties in so nice to what Jesus said, that blessed are the pure in heart. And so it seems that heart purity has a factor here in the quality of our reasoning.
In what you see and what you think, right? Right.
And whatever we think about God's methodology here, one thing you got to say for sure, it was surely worked.
Right.
It was very impactful. So
Right. Okay, let's get to the next picture. Acts 17:3 was opening, explaining the scriptures. So reasoning implied speech interchange and dialogue and instructing but listening, and then explaining gives us this idea of opening, helping people understand, explaining things. And then thirdly, the word in Acts 17:3, the next word is proving. And so there you see the definition of paratithemi, to place something before someone, to set forth in teaching, to demonstrate or point out. So let me show you a literal use of this, which helps give us the picture. Acts 16, verse 34. Acts 16:34, then he brought them up into his house, and he set food before them. Acts 17:3, explaining and proving, it's the same word. The Philippian jailer set food before them, and Paul proved that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise again, and it's the same word. So it's used in Acts 16 in the literal sense of lay out a meal, set a meal out, and it's used in Acts 17 in the figurative sense of lay out an argument, lay out the reasons, lay out the order of thought, lay out before them, set the table, show them why you believe this, why you're claiming this, why you're arguing for this. Does that picture make sense? So you've got the picture of opening the scriptures, and then you've got a similar idea of setting it out before them. So both of those relate to that idea of taking the time, being willing to explain things, to show the order of thought, to show how things connect, to lay things open so that people can understand. Both of those communicate those ideas. We have an English idiom for this, don't we? We say, let me lay it out for you. And we mean, let me explain to you how I got there. Let me show you the reason why I came to that conclusion or why I'm saying that to you. That's exactly what this idea is here. And in line with that, we should note here, even though it's not a word used in Acts 17, we should note the idea of defending. Acts 22, verse 1. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. So there we have Paul defending, and he uses that word a couple more times in his trials. But go over to Philippians 1. Philippians 1, the end of verse 7, Paul refers to the Philippians as partakers with him in the defense of the gospel. And the same thing is in verse 16. I am put here for the defense of the gospel. And so that's the word that's used in that really well-known phrase in 1 Peter 3:15 that I'll just read to you. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that's in you. So there the ideas are of defending it, but it fits right together with that idea of laying it out for them or opening it up for them so that they can see, so that they can understand. Always be ready to explain, to prove, to defend, to talk about Jesus and why you believe what you believe. The next thing we want to observe in Acts 17 is it's not exactly a word study because it's just the plain old word for saying something. But it's interesting that at the end of Acts 17:3, if you want to go back there, he was reasoning, explaining, proving, and saying, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. He just said it. And so I call that stating. He just stated it. This Jesus is the Christ. And so even when we are in an open interchange of ideas with someone else and willing to hear what they believe, there still is an appropriate point to state what's true. And I don't think this means that you can't say something like, I believe that this is true, because that is ultimately what you're saying, that you believe that it's true. But you can still say that in a good statement kind of a way. I believe that this is true. Jesus did die, and Jesus did rise again. That's different from saying, my own personal opinion is that Jesus might have died and risen again. You see, there is a role for us kind of stating, even while you're allowing for the person you're talking to state something different, right? That's really part of the key. So Paul states it, and I just note there, Acts 19:8, he entered the synagogue, and for 3 months he spoke boldly. So there is a role for some bold speaking. Then our next word in Acts, our last word in Acts 17:4 is, some of them were persuaded. That is interesting, huh? To cause to come to a particular point of view or course of action, to convince, to persuade, to appeal to. I feel like that word gives us a helpful reminder about the human side of conversion. We've seen some things this morning that emphasize the divine side of conversion, God's sovereign work. But we should not conclude from that people come to Jesus without being convinced of it, without being persuaded of it, without for themselves coming to the conclusion that I believe that and I want that, right? So we need to make sure we keep that human element to it. And this word really brings that home. They were persuaded. Paul's reasoning and stating and explaining and proving, used by God, but in their minds and hearts it worked. And they were persuaded. And so there are several references there on your handout that in which we see that same thing happening. And we don't have time right now to go look through all that, but I noticed the very last of those references. Well, no, two of those I want to show you. 26:28. Will you go there? Acts 26:28. I want to show you that this is the word in two well-known passages. Acts 26:28. And Agrippa said to Paul, and there's a translational argument about how to translate this best, but in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? So there's our persuade word. So Agrippa's saying, you think you're going to convince me that fast? Are you going to sow? And maybe that was because that was what was happening. And he was trying to buy himself some time. Maybe he was saying, hey, this is too fast. I can't believe this already. Or maybe he was saying, yeah, if you think you're going to persuade me that fast, you're crazy. I don't know. I don't know which one he meant. It doesn't really say. But he knew full well that that was what Paul was doing, and that was what he had to decide whether he was going to be persuaded or not by it. And you love how Paul says, well, whether short or long, I just wish you would come to be like me, to know Jesus. And so then it's also the word that is in 2 Corinthians 5:11. You guys know that passage? Knowing therefore the fear of the Lord, we persuade men. Because we know that everyone's going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, Paul says, we persuade. So it's the same word. It's the same word there. Okay, skip the middle section, the second active meaning for a minute. I'll come back and comment on that in a second. Go to the third section, the passive, which means to be won over as the result of persuasion. So that's what we have in Acts 17. They were persuaded. They were won over. And notice in that definition, to be won over as the result of persuasion, to be persuaded and believe, to obey and follow. Did that happen in Acts 17:4? What's the word? You see it there, I guess, in your handout, huh? They joined. So they literally came and followed. And interestingly, actually, that Greek word is passive. That is, they were joined. The Bible just will not let us forget that it's God who does it. They were joined to Paul and Silas, literally. But the point is, they came by the work of God and they followed. They were won over by the persuasion. So that reminds us that we are people have to take action on the truth about Jesus, right? It isn't just something to be heard. And that's where there's such a big difference with Greek dialogue that I talked about at the beginning. In Greek dialogue, you could talk back and forth and come away saying, that was cool. We shared lots of interesting ideas. Yeah, interesting. Interesting guy to talk to, right? But that the gospel can't ultimately end that way. It can't end with, that was interesting. It has to end with, take up your cross and come follow me, Jesus says. And if you're going to look back, you're not fit for the kingdom of God. And so there is a persuasive element to the gospel. Now that fits together with everything else, right? It fits together with taking the time to prove and to explain, and it doesn't in any way mean that you race people through to some decision, but it does mean that ultimately the gospel calls people to be persuaded and come follow Jesus. So can you see how those 5 concepts fit together for us and how we think about wisely talking about Jesus? There are aspects there that are very, very patient, and there are aspects there that are very urgent. And there are aspects there that are along the line of stating, and there are aspects there that are along the line of listening and learning and interacting. And so that's why I think you put it together, and the picture is of wise talking about Jesus. So I just wanted us to work through those things. Now, there is one other, and this is off topic from what we've been talking about this morning, but there is this section I skipped over, this meaning of patho, to be persuaded. That means to be so convinced that one puts confidence in something. And that the word isn't used that way in Acts, and so it doesn't necessarily to connect to what we're talking about this morning. But those passages are very, very intriguing and devotional. In other words, they really challenge us about whether you're putting your confidence in what you believe in. You see what I'm saying? You can believe something in your head, in theory, but then not actually place your confidence in that, not actually place your dependence in that. And so there's some really fascinating passages related to that idea of being so convinced of something that you put your confidence in it Have you become so convinced of Jesus that you really are actually putting your confidence in Jesus? And some of those passages are right for believers. They're not just gospel passages. So I gave some of those to you there. We can't look them up now, but if you want a kind of intriguing study to do on your own, you could work through that series of verses.